Okay, so Genesis chapter 6 is where we're going to be. Now, I had intended to probably do the whole chapter, but I think that was a little too ambitious, so we're going to do about half the chapter here today. A lot here in Genesis 6, and even as we make our way through this morning, there is a lot of details and things that I just don't have the ability or time to cover, but I do hope that at least as we make our way through this text, that some things are clear and that there's some type of direction here for us this morning. So we're going to make our way through verses 1 through 12. And as we come here to this section, brethren, unfortunately, when you're preaching through Genesis, every preacher knows that when he hits 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, essentially it's not the most joyful sermon series to go through because you just have to cover a lot of, hard, difficult text. And so as we come to this section here this morning, we hit a probably the most sobering and heavy portion of Scripture at the beginning of the Bible. As we left off last time, right, we have the fall of Adam and Eve into sin. And then in 4 and 5, you see kind of sin's consequences and sin's power immediately begin to take effect. And man begins to experience sin in two ways. He begins to experience sin in that it has power over him and that it is able to corrupt his heart. Right? It's able to have control over him. And we saw that in the story of Cain. And then sin also, brethren, sin begins to have its reign and its rule in the fact that men experience now the penalty of sin, and that is men die. And we saw that last time here as well. So by the time we finished chapter 5, we're coming, to the full reality of what sin and death are bringing about into the world. So as we pick up here at 6, you guys can already probably feel, and as you've read this section before, you can feel the anticipation of what's going to come. We didn't leave off in chapter 5 thinking, but it's really going to turn around the next chapter. You get done with 5 and you go, this seems like it's going to continue to get worse. And so as we pick up here today, brethren, we got to come just face to face with the reality that sin's corruption of all things, of all creation, of heaven and earth, of both the seen and the unseen realm, we're going to see this morning just how total and just how absolutely complete sin's corruption is in the world that God created. And as we continue our way through this chapter, we're really just going to focus on two things this morning because there's a bunch of stuff I want to continue to go through in this chapter, probably next time. What I want to deal with here this morning is just that reality of the total corruption of the whole world. And I think why the Bible makes this point so specific and so clear for us as we hit chapter 6. So I want to look at two things here this morning in light of that point. I want to look first, I think our first point in the first couple of verses, we're going to see kind of the pinnacle of this corruption, right? We've already seen corruption in 4 and 5. We've seen what sin begins to do in the heart of men, specifically in Cain. And then as his descendants come about, we see what it does in someone like Lamech. It makes them very evil, very wicked. But now, as we continue, we're going to see here in 6, this wickedness and this corruption, it's going to peak. It's going to come to this climax, and we're really going to see this ultimate pinnacle of God's beautiful creation just completely corrupt. And we're going to see the story that the Bible gives us, brethren, I think for us to be able to think of just how devastating and corrupting sin has been in the world. And second, we're going to look at the completeness of this corruption, because God is going to make multiple statements here in light of what he sees. And he's going to make statements about the completeness that this corruption has in the earth and how we ought to think about that here this morning. So, those will be our 2 points here, the pinnacle of corruption and the completeness of the corruption. So as we look at this first one, I'm just going to kind of say this at the outset. This is going to be the longer one, and you'll see why here in a moment. So let's go ahead. Let's read verses 1 through 4, and then we'll begin to flesh out this first point. So let's look at verses 1 through 4 here again in Genesis chapter 6. Genesis 6, beginning here in verse 1. When man began to multiply on the face of the land, and daughters were born to them, the sons of God saw that the daughters of man were attractive, and they took as their wives any they chose. And then the Lord said, My spirit shall not abide in man forever, for he is flesh. His days shall be 120 years. And the Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterward, when the sons of God came into the daughters of man, and they bore children to them. And these were the mighty men who were of old, the men of renown. So right here then, at the beginning in 6, you get kind of a very interesting account of some event that is taking place here before we get to this climactic judgment of God upon the world, right? Before we get to that judgment, God saw it fit in these first 4 verses to give us this glimpse into a story and an event that takes place. And I think the reason for this here, brethren, in verses 1 through 4 is I think this brief account kind of slips its way in here is that God is intending to set the story up a certain way, right? Because if when you go and you read this section from 5 into 6, at least in my own mind as you read it, verse 5 seems to be the most natural place to kind of pick up here, right? God looks out then on the world after all these men are dying, and then he makes a conclusion about them. But for a particular reason, he puts this story in verses 1 through 4 here right at the front. And I think he's doing this to help us see why his judgment that he's going to make about the world is such a devastating judgment. And the reason for that is I think this story is going to stand here as not the only story, but the pinnacle of stories, the pinnacle of corruption that displays how the whole created order has now been corrupted by sin and has just fallen into absolute chaos. And so as we read these first 4 verses, I want to say that at the beginning because I think then we need to pay careful attention and to ask ourselves, what point is God trying to make then in these first 4 verses so that when we get to the rest of the chapter, we go, wow, God's pronouncement and God's judgment here, it stands in such starkness and contrast. And so we want to pay careful attention to what this pinnacle of corruption in the story is, and we really need to try to understand it rightly. And so as we read these verses, right, there's a few things just on the surface about what happens, right? I'm not going to reread it again, but just kind of summarize, right? So in 6:1, we begin to read that man begins to do what? Well, they begin to multiply and fill the earth. Just like we heard about man was going to do in Genesis 1 and 2, and just like men begin to do there in Genesis 4 and 5, right? They begin to have sons and have daughters, multiply and fill over the face of the earth. And so 6:1 picks up this theme again, right? Mankind in general begins to multiply and fill the earth, but it makes a very specific description and claim here that man began to multiply on the face of the land and daughters were born to them. And so you get the specific, the specificity in what's coming about through this multiplication, daughters. And then in verse 2, you get the problem presented, right? Now all of a sudden the problem comes in. And you get a specific group or designation of people or beings here called the sons of God. And these sons of God, they see these daughters of man, and they're attracted to them, and they take them as wives, and they produce children and offspring that later on we'll see are called the Nephilim. And so on the surface, right, On the surface, that seems really basic. It's very straightforward in that sense. But the question becomes, who are these sons of God, right? Who are they? And brethren, really, without answering that question, then we really can't come to know what the problem is, right? If we don't know who they are and what they did and why it was a problem, then we're not going to really understand the issue here at the forefront. And so, why is the Bible portraying these sons of God in a bad light based upon what they did? Well, I think in order to answer that, we need to answer the question, who are they? I think if we're able to do that, we can see then why what they did in pursuing daughters of men and marrying them and procreating with them, why this was such a bad thing, such a corrupting thing. And so the answer to that question is a bit more complicated and a lot less brief than what I just said there about those first 4 verses. So I want to spend some time here dealing with it so we can make some proper conclusions. And you may just have to buckle up here with me for a little bit as we go through this. But as we go through some of these verses, you may have some more questions after this. And I won't be able to answer all of them, but I hope to at least make my case here. So let me kind of say this right at the forefront. This text is disputed among Christians, right? This text is disputed among Christians as to who these sons of God are and therefore what the story is about here. And I'll just say this. There are good Christians on different sides of this issue. And if you are on the other side of this issue, you're a good Christian. I don't think anything different of you. And if you're on my side, great. I like you just a little bit more. And if you have no position, well, I'm just going to be honest. I'm here to convince you of mine here this morning. So I want to make that clear at the outset that there are different opinions on this text, and Christians have differed on this, I think, in good faith. But I say all that to say this, brethren. I want to offer what I believe to be the biblical position, right? What I don't want to do is give you 5 positions and be like, it's just Russian roulette. You kind of just see what happens. I want to give you what I believe to be the biblical position, and I'm going to do so in a way where I'm going to try to convince you. So if you don't hold my position or you're unsure, just be clear. I'm trying to make my case. I am not in any way attacking your position. I just simply want you to know I want to make a convincing argument because I want you to believe something about this text. So as we go through, please know that if you disagree, that's okay. But I do want to seek to give a good answer, and I ultimately want to convince you of it here this morning. So let's get to it. How have Christians answered this question about who the sons of God are? And while there are more than a few offers and explanations for this, I'm really only going to give a few of the most basic and mainstream interpretations of this text for simplicity and time's sake. So let me give you the 2 most popular interpretations. And the second interpretation, I'll just say right up front, is the one that I will argue for and spend the vast majority of our time on here this morning. So the first view then, how have some Christians sought to explain who these sons of God are? Well, the first view, it seeks to identify these sons of God, and they seek to identify them in a view called the Sethite view. And this view is simply named after Adam's first son, right? Go back to Genesis 4, Genesis chapter 5. What's Adam's next child after Cain kills Abel? Well, they give birth to another son. His name is Seth. And so this view ends up being named after Seth. And the reason it receives this name for its view is because it holds that the sons of God are the godly line of Seth. It holds that the sons of God are the godly line of Seth who love God, worship God, and that these sons of God, these believers, what they do is they end up intermarrying with unbelieving women who do not love and worship God. And so in chapter 4, right after Seth is born, this is usually drawn on this particular section. In chapter 4, do you guys remember what it says after Seth is born, what people began to do at that time? Do you guys remember what it says? Yes? Yes, call upon the name of the Lord. So if you go back there to the end of 4, he says right here, to Seth also a son was born, and he called his name Enosh. At that time, so around the time of Seth, people began to call upon the name of the Lord. So this is often drawn into association with Seth and his line, that at that time, from Seth and his descendants on, his lineage on, these people began to call upon the name of the Lord in worship, in faith, and that these were the godly men and women who come from Seth's line. And what ends up happening is these godly men from Seth's line begin to see the daughters of man, which in this view they believe are the descendants of Cain, who we know is not holy, does not love God, does not worship God. In fact, as we remember last time, he's of the devil, right? He's of his father, the devil. He's a seed of the serpent. And so in this view, Seth's godly line, specifically the men, they see these daughters of man as descendants of Cain, and they intermarry with them, and they make children with them. And this is portrayed as evil and wicked and ungodly. And so it's concluded then that what you have going on is you have this intermixing of godly and ungodly in marriage, which, as you guys know, go read through the Old Testament, and what's one of the refrains that you hear all the time towards God's people about what they're not to do with the nations? What's one of those refrains? Yeah, well, not just marry. They should marry. Yes, don't marry the daughters of the nations, right? Don't go out to those women, and you think about all the examples, especially with the patriarchs, right? When Isaac is, or Abraham is a servant to go send out a wife for Isaac, what does he tell his servant to not do? Right? Please don't get a daughter of men, right? Get one from my lineage, my tribe. And so they see the great sin then in view here is that you have this mixed marriage between believer and unbeliever. Seth's line, full of these godly lineage of believers, marrying unbelievers, specifically Cain's line and their daughters. And while I am very, very sympathetic to this view, I do not think it is the way to understand who the sons of God are. The second view, and I think the correct view, is what has been normally entitled the angelic view. And I will go through a few reasons here as to why I believe this view to be the proper view. So I want to look at 3 things here as to why I think the angelic view is the proper view. And the first is going to be contextual reasons. Second, I want to look at language, how the phrase is used elsewhere in the Bible. And then 3, I want to give some thought to some historical matters and some historical reasoning. So I'm going to present these 3 in order as to why I think the angelic view is a better view here to understand what this phrase, the sons of God, means. So, first, when we read at the beginning of Genesis 6, right, that when man began to multiply, that phrase is matching up previously with chapter 5, where men begin to do what? They begin to have sons and daughters. So in 5:1, this is the book of the generations of man. When God created man and made him in his likeness, and then what does man begin to do? Man begins to have sons and daughters. And you get this repetition all the way throughout chapter 5, right? Adam fathered Seth, he lived this long, and then he had what? He had other sons and daughters. And so I think when we get to 6, and we read, when man began to multiply, we should think this is a continuation and an explanation of what has already happened in chapter 5 when man began to have sons and daughters. And what's interesting here, brethren, about this connection is that daughters are mentioned being born to men in chapter 5 but with not any real prominence, right? The men are prominent in 5. But then the daughters kind of take this prominent place here in chapter 6, right? They become very prominent in chapter 6. Now let me ask you a question, and I want you to think about this and answer this. Whose line or whose descendants are these daughters born to? Whose line or whose descendants are these daughters born to? Well, maybe it's way more obvious than I think it is. Okay, let me say. They're born to Adam and his son Seth, right? These daughters, they are of the lineage and descent of Adam, and by extension, Seth. And so it seems the mention of daughters is explicitly related here in relation to Adam and Seth in their line, right? Which I think when we read that then is going to pose a problem for that first view. Because if you remember in the first view, the daughters of men are presupposed to be associated with whose line? Cain's line. But the emphasis in chapter 5 into chapter 6 is that these sons and daughters are associated with the godly line. They're associated with Adam and Seth's line, which I think ends up posing a problem if one tries to categorize these daughters of man as coming from Cain's line. I'm not saying that Cain didn't have daughters, but I find it very interesting, brethren, that in Cain's line, there's no mention of daughters, but then in Adam and Seth's line, it's a repetitive theme. No daughters are ever mentioned in regards to Cain and his lineage in chapter 4. And I think, brethren, if Moses intended to make that point, he would seem to be doing a poor job at connecting the daughters of man to Cain and his line when the sole mention of daughters being born to man is actually directly and explicitly connected to Adam and Seth and their godly line. So it would seem odd then that the term sons of God would be a reference to the godly line of Seth, speaking specifically about a godly male line, as the ones who are looking out on the daughters of men and taking whom they choose, given the fact that these daughters seem to be directly connected back to Seth's line. It would be like them looking upon their own rather than looking upon somebody else's daughters. And so I honestly, brethren, I think this really weakens the Sethite view just in context, and I think it makes it a harder position to take contextually. But second, and I think more convincing here, is just going to be the language of sons of God itself. Right? This specific phrase is only used a few other times in the Old Testament. So, and all 3 of these specific occurrences fall within Job. And I want to take you through all these 3 occurrences because I think it's important for you to hear these and to see these. So let's keep our finger here in Genesis. Let's flip over to Job. So I'm going to hit these pretty quick, but I want you to hear this phrase. And as we're reading these, I want you to think about the context in which the phrase the sons of God is being used. All right, so let's read these occurrences. So first one, Job chapter 1, verse 6. Now there was a day when who? The sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan also came among them. Right? So when these sons of God are coming before the Lord, who else is walking in procession with these so-called sons of God? Satan. Now, we know Satan has, he can appear in forms as an angel of light. He was a snake there in the garden, but we know Satan to be obviously a spiritual creature. He's not a man. He's not a human being. He's an angelic being, a spiritual being. And so he's coming before the Lord. And it says, as the sons of God come forward, who else comes forward? Well, he comes forward. So you get this again here, Job chapter 2, verse 1. Again, there was a day when the sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan also came among them to present himself before the Lord. So same exact phrase gets used again. And once again, what you get right here is this dialogue between Satan and God. And you get this idea that it's in this heavenly presence or this heavenly courtroom where angelic spiritual beings dwell. And here comes Satan wanting to tempt Job and to cause him to suffer. And then you get this one more time here in Job 38. And this one is honestly the hardest one to get past. I mean, I had to deal with this one myself. And I think this one just really kind of puts the nail in the coffin as to how you understand this particular phrase. Because here in Job 38, what's happening is the Lord now answers Job after all his pleading. And you guys remember what God does in this, right, to answer Job? I mean, he kind of tells Job, strap up your big boy pants and you answer me some of these questions. And he starts going through how God made all the world, right? So, and listen what he says. I'm going to start back in verse 4, and then I'm going to finish right there with an emphasis on 7. So Job 38, beginning in verse 4. Where were you when I laid the foundation of the earth? Tell me, if you have understanding. Who determined its measurements? Surely you know. Who stretched a line upon it? On what were its bases sunk, or who laid its cornerstone? Now listen. When the morning stars sang together, and all the sons of God shouted for joy. And brethren, I think when you read that one, obviously what you're getting in here is almost like a recount of what we read through there in Genesis 1 and 2 of the creation of all things. And it would seem to be a very odd place for God to speak about the sons of God shouting for joy when God is beginning to create and make everything. And I think the best way to understand that is there's these angelic beings in the heavenly places sitting there with God Himself, and they, like these morning stars, are singing and shouting for joy at what God is doing when He begins to make all things. And so this language of the sons of God, brethren, I think is very consistent. It's very airtight, and it never moves off of that meaning. And so I think this understanding is also solidified here in the New Testament from our New Testament reading that we heard from Giovanni. So if you want to flip there again, Jude. I put Jude chapter 1 on there just so no one was confused, but there's really, I guess, no chapter mark there. It's just Jude verses 5 through 7. But I want you to notice how Jude speaks about what I think is going on here in Genesis 6. So he says this again. Now I want to remind you, although you once fully knew it, that Jesus, who saved a people out of the land of Egypt, afterward destroyed those who did not believe. And the angels, who did not stay within their own position of authority, but left their proper dwelling, He's kept in eternal chains under gloomy darkness until the judgment of the great day. Just as Sodom and Gomorrah and the surrounding cities, which likewise indulged in sexual immorality and pursued unnatural desire, serve as an example by undergoing a punishment of eternal fire. So, even here in Jude, I think Jude is commenting on this past event here in Genesis, and notice the comparison that he makes to describe the sin of these angels. Because I think it's very clear here he's speaking of angels, right? In 6, and the angels, right? Obviously, angel can be translated a few different ways. I don't think it makes any sense to say messengers here. I think it makes total sense to say angels. And the angels, and then he's going to go on, what did these angels do? Well, he's going to make a comparison and highlight the sin of these angels with the sin of who else? Yeah, the sin of Sodom and Gomorrah. And how is he going to do that? Well, he's going to state in what way did Sodom and Gomorrah sin? right? In what way? Yeah, sexual immorality. And then he's going to make this point that they sinned in like manner or in a similar fashion as these angels did, right? Listen to what he says here again. Just as Sodom and Gomorrah and the surrounding cities, which likewise, or you could say in a similar way to who? Well, who did he just speak before Sodom and Gomorrah? The angels, right? He just spoke about them previously. So the comparison being made here is these angels, which I believe are these sons of God, they're leaving their position, their authority, their natural dwelling, and they sinned in like manner or similar manner as the inhabitants of Sodom, in that they did what? They committed sexual immorality and they pursued unnatural desire, which is not a good translation of this. It should read, or strange flesh. That they indulged in sexual immorality and pursued in strange flesh. And literally right here, this idea of strange flesh is you guys have heard the term heteros from, like, we say someone's a heterosexual, right? And what we mean by that is, heteros is the basic meaning is something of a different kind, right? And that's where we get our term when we use it when we say something like, oh, yep, that man's a heterosexual, which is the right thing, right? And it simply means that he is attracted to and wants to come together with what? The opposite sex, right? Not the same, not the same type or the same as he is, but the opposite. But brethren, in this context, that's not a good thing, right? The indulgence with strange or other or different, I would even go so far as to say is opposite flesh, gets highlighted here as this gross perversion and completely unnatural way in which angels who were given their own authority, their own proper dwelling, their own proper abode in which they dwelt in, and instead, through unnatural desire, through sexual immorality, through chasing after opposite or different flesh, came down and took women as wives in these twisted and unholy unions. And I think when you compile that evidence together, brethren, I can hear somebody out who disagrees, but I'm not saying that like, yes, that's the view that I wanted. Brethren, I think that's just the view the Bible brought me to. And let me say this, because I know some of you are thinking of it. Some of you have probably never heard that before. Some of you had, and you're like, I still don't agree with that. Some of you are like, I don't know where I stand. But I think all of us could agree on this. This seems odd. Does it not? Does anyone in here read that and go, yeah, that's normal. That's just a normal day in the office. It's like nobody reads this and goes, yeah, that's just normal. I mean, we read this and we think, man, this is kind of odd. And brethren, listen, I'll grant that it is. However, brethren, it's at this very point that I want to challenge us all here to think why it is odd. Like, why do we think it's odd to read such a thing? Why does it strike us as an odd situation? Because I'll say this again, surely it's a perplexing one, right? To look at it and try to come to grips and to terms with what's happening, like angels rebelling in disobedience, leaving their proper station, chasing after strange flesh, right? In direct violation of, God's created order. That is most certainly a striking scene. But I think if we were all honest with ourselves, brethren, we would see this as a very odd thing, only in the sense that we have a difficult time believing. That we have a difficult time believing that something like this could happen and could actually be a possibility in God's world. I'll at least speak for myself in that. I don't think we think it's odd because, weird supernatural stuff can't happen. Brethren, we're Christians. I do think we think it's odd, though, because we find it hard to believe that something like this could happen. And brethren, we have a hard time believing that something like this could happen. Something so supernatural, something so strange could possibly happen in real life. And I think this reaction, brethren, is actually more revealing of us and what's happened to us as a people rather than the Bible being strange. And I think it is for this reason. Brethren, we as people, and I speak for all of us in here, we have become desensitized and out of touch with the reality that we live in a supernatural world. All right, brother, we've become desensitized to this reality. That as a people, I think it's important for us to recognize in here. As a people, in modern day America, the modern day West, we have been extremely influenced by an and I mean against, right? And that's it, anti-supernatural worldview of secularism. And what does secularism say? There is no God, right? We've been influenced by an anti-supernatural worldview of secularism and of modernity, which believes that unless you can see it, or unless you can touch it, or unless you can taste it, it doesn't exist. And brethren, as much as we would want to claim, well, we're not like that, we believe in the supernatural on paper, brethren, I think in reality, we have actually become more desensitized to this reality than we would probably want to admit in regards to the supernatural. And brethren, the role that the supernatural plays in the Bible and plays in history. And this ought not to be. I mean, brethren, we as God's people, we ought to recognize and I think be the most in tune people with supernatural things because of the God that we worship in the Bible that we have, right? We are a people who believe God spoke everything out of nothing and that God rose Jesus from the dead. He rose a dead man and gave him life to never die again. So, brethren, we at our core have to, I think, fight against this and be a people with the supernatural view of the world, because I think this has led us to come to a text like this and just find it a very odd thing. Which I think, brethren, leads me then to my last line of evidence for the angelic view. And that's to consider the historical record and historical circumstances. And I can definitely get into this later as far as diving into details, but suffice it to say this. Brethren, almost all, and I really want to emphasize that, and usually you want to be careful coming up to the pulpit and saying every time or all or something like that. You want to be careful doing that. But in this instance, I will say almost all of human history attests to the reality that supernatural beings and humans intertwined in procreation. And the reason, brethren, I can say all of human history, or I can't say all of human history, is obviously there are some people in church history who don't agree with this interpretation. However, I do want to say this. Before those interpretations, all people, all ancient civilizations, all pagan religions, all mythologies in the ancient world affirmed this angelic view. And I think you simply have to deal with that reality. Now, I recognize that just because ancient people believe something does not instantly make it true, right? Hear me out on that. Just because a bunch of ancient people believe something does not necessitate that that is a true thing. And I also recognize, brethren, that in many of these ancient accounts, these ancient myths, these ancient religions, these ancient pagan mythologies, I recognize that in many of the accounts, that what's stated about God or gods, there's often a lot of contradiction and untruthful things at many points that deviate from Scripture. So hear me say that too. I want to make that very clear. However, brethren, I think if you were to take, and when I say this, brethren, it's like I could nerd out on this, but I'd probably waste my time and violate a commandment in the New Covenant of not getting off on angels and stuff. But brethren, the evidence for this in the ancient world, in its acceptation among people, brethren, is just, it's widespread. It is absolutely widespread. And you would not find one ancient civilization or religion or mythology who did not somehow attest to this truth. And the reason I say that is because, brethren, I know what we as modern people, because I do this. You know what we as modern people, when we hear that? Those people were idiots. Right? They didn't know anything. They didn't know the things that we know today. Or they got lost in fables and mythologies, and they did all these drugs and got lost in things. Or, we're just going to make up some kind of excuse for how, and whatever they got to say doesn't really hold any weight or value. And brethren, I will say this. I think it can be a very foolish thing in a very modern way to think that just because this was the opinion or stories of the ancient past that was so much shrouded in myth, that it's by default untrue. Right? I think that's a foolish thing to do. Because let me ask you a question. Can any of you think of a significant story or event in the Bible that's attested to by other ancient and pagan religions and myths? Right? The next one, right? The flood. And I don't know if you guys have ever been to the Ark Encounter. I know some of you guys have. I know, brother, you have. I've been with this brother. Great time. Loved it. I want to go again. I want to take Manny next time. It's a great time. You could read the Hebrew on the wall. But brethren, when you go to a place like that, I mean, when you walk away from it, obviously we don't believe in the flood because ultimately because of all this other evidence. We believe it because the Bible says it. Brethren, you go to these displays that they have, these booths that they have, these videos that they've produced, and they show you how, brethren, I kid you not, every single civilization has a flood story. Like all over the world. You can't find one that didn't. You just can't. And there's no exaggeration in that. That every single ancient accounting and mythology of the world had a flood role in a flood story that was so prominent in their history that it survived all the way through, right? And now, obviously, granted, some of the facts, some of the names, they're twisted, they're wrong. I agree with that. But brethren, we have to be able to look at that and I think recognize clearly that even with the errors and the untruths, that those myths, those legends, those mythologies do preserve some true accounting and retelling of something that really happened in human history. Namely, that a flood came, covered the world. And brethren, the same is the case in the account of angelic beings. The same is of this account of angelic beings coming down and procreating with the daughters of men. You can go, if you want, and do all the source work yourself, and you can recount every ancient mythology, and you will find this event in all of them. Brethren, they all recount it. And they all recount whether it's Sumerian or Mesopotamian, or whether it's Assyrian, or whether it's a Canaanite myth, or whether it's from Greco-Roman sources, or whatever it may be, whatever civilization you want to picture in your mind, brethren, they believe this. And they recount all of these similar stories of how these demigod figures, these supernatural half man, half supernatural being came about to be, these Nephilim here in the Bible. How they displayed this great size, this great power, right? This great prowess among men. Brethren, it's in every single one. And my question then has to be posed, because I had to pose this for myself. Is it just one big lie then? Like, are we that cynical about humanity to say, yeah, it's just one big lie? Brethren, because it's not about the flood. And I think when we come with this one, brethren, obviously the historical evidence came last in this order. I want Scripture to be primary and to hold its weight. But I think when we look at the historical record, brethren, we have to ask, was this just one big fabrication? Are we really willing to look at all of that evidence and all of human history and just conclude everyone except a few people in the past had it totally wrong? And so, brethren, I get it. We could come to this, and it kind of is. It's an odd text. And it seems out of place. But brethren, I think in reality, the reason it does is because we kind of stand as an oddity in human history, not the text and not the ancient people. They would actually look at us and think, you guys are kind of odd. You guys are, I don't know why you wouldn't think that. And brethren, for no other ancient people before us thought about this view of history differently than the supernatural mingling of angels in the world. So, that was a lot. And I think when we combine, brethren, all this evidence together, I think it becomes overwhelming, in my opinion, that the angelic interpretation fits this biblical context about these sons of God back here in Genesis chapter 6. I think the biblical language, the context, and history all attest to this. And brethren, if it is the case then that this portrays this reality for us of the supernatural being so intertwined and wedded with the natural, brethren, I think it is just an utter display here of how sin has corrupted the entirety of everything. Not just the seen, right? Not just the things we could see with our eyes, but it's literally ripped at the fabric of reality that we can't see with our eyes. That the supernatural realm itself has been twisted and mended in such a way that God can look at heaven and earth, the natural and the supernatural, and it can be completely corrupted and undone by the fall. And brethren, that the created order which God had made has to this point, I think in light of this story, that it's completely and totally rebelled and become so twisted that even the angelic host has gone from their proper abode and has done such perverse things, is the reason why Moses puts this here in Genesis 6 to display for you just how corrupt creation has become. Brethren, the whole cosmic order has come undone. And this story stands, I think, as the pinnacle example. Obviously not the only example, but definitely the pinnacle of how the heavens and the earth, the natural and the supernatural, brethren, they have become twisted and utterly corrupted by sin. And so then when we turn from this then, and we look at what God has to say about this, brethren, I think that's when we see this second point here about God's pronouncement of what He's seeing. So let's look here. Begin here in verse 5 again of chapter 6. Continue to read on here to verse 12. So Genesis 5, Genesis 6, verse 5, going to pick up back there. The Lord saw that the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and that every intention of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. And the Lord regretted that He had made man on the earth, and it grieved Him to His heart. And so the Lord said, I will blot out man whom I have created from the face of the land, man and animals and creeping things and the birds of the heavens, for I am sorry that I have made them. But Noah found favor in the eyes of the Lord. And these are the generations of Noah. Noah was a righteous man, blameless in his generation, and Noah walked with God, and Noah had 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. And now the earth was corrupt in God's sight, and the earth was filled with violence. And God saw the earth, and behold, it was corrupt, for all flesh had corrupted their way on the earth. And so, brethren, as we read this next section here, it's really kind of capped here by these 2 very related and very similar pronouncements by God. I mean, verse 5 is just devastating. Because it's like the Lord comes down to check in on His creation. And it says that He saw. And that He regretted. And that it grieved Him to His heart to see what He's seeing. That all of creation has come to this point of corruption and ruin. And it wants you to feel, brethren, I think, just how bad this is. Right? This is not just Moses' perspective here. Why does the text highlight the Lord saw, the Lord regretted, the Lord said? Because, brethren, He's making a judgment about this. And I think as Christians here, we want to stop and to think, do we feel just how bad this is based upon how the Lord says it is? Do we feel what He feels in this? You notice the kind of judgment that God makes about man here. He says, the Lord saw the wickedness of man was great in the earth, right? And then He says this about man. Every intention of the thoughts of his heart was what? Only evil, continually. And then later on there in 12, now the earth was corrupt in God's sight, and the earth was filled with what? Not with image bearers reflecting His glory. The earth was filled with violence. And God saw the earth, behold, it was corrupt, for all flesh had corrupted their way on the earth. Brethren, in light of what's transpired since chapter 3, this is just a devastating, an absolutely devastating judgment that God makes here to pronounce this type of thing upon His own creation. The wickedness and violence abounded here, as it said, because the intention of the thoughts of his heart of man was only evil continually. And brethren, we have to let that indictment, I think, shape our thinking and cause us, I think, to consider the world and even our own ways. Because, brethren, this often, as you know, before you were a Christian or as you talk to people who are not Christians, this often becomes a sticking point for people as they read this story. I mean, who naturally wants to say, yeah, that's me? I'm in that group. Thoughts of my intentions of my heart, only evil continually. Who on earth stands up and says, that's me? Naturally. And brethren, this becomes a major sticking point for people reading this story. They think, why would God do such a thing of pronouncing such a harsh penalty, such a harsh indictment? And He's not doing it just on a few bad guys. It's not like, oh, Hitler and Stalin, and He's picking out the worst of the worst. Brethren, He says all flesh. Every single human being, man, woman, and child. And people think, how could He do such a thing? And brethren, it's because of this reality. Men's hearts have been corrupted, and men have become depraved in their thinking because of sin. And brethren, this tale here in Genesis tells us what would happen to men if men were left alone. Brethren, if we were left alone in here without God intervening, without God in the world, this would be all of us. And it was all of us before Christ. That nothing would be produced from men and from us but evil and wickedness and violence. And brethren, this is because of what we've talked about already in the nature of the fall. The fall fundamentally did something to the human heart. It's corrupted it. And now it produces evil. And brethren, all men have to come to terms with this reality. Every single person at some point has to come to terms with this reality. Because I don't think anybody in human history has ever looked at the world and thought, everything's perfect. Everybody looks at the world and says, why is it broken? But nobody wants to say, it's broken because of us. And brethren, we want to hear God's pronouncement for what it is. God's making a true pronouncement upon humankind. He's saying it's man's fault. Because man's heart has been corrupted. Because man's heart is evil. And brethren, we all must find ourselves in that category if we are to then properly relate ourselves to God and Jesus Christ. Because, brethren, as we know, this is why Jesus is so central and so vital to the Christian religion, why He's so important to us. Because if we stand outside of Him, we stand in this other group of people, one that are filled with nothing but evil and malicious and wicked thoughts. And the only way that we can come to Jesus and to see what He does for us and to see what He has accomplished for us is to see ourselves in the full light of that category. We were not right. And in fact, we are the ones who have brought ruin and destruction upon ourselves. We are responsible. And as we're going to see later on, this flood can't fix that. It might wipe it out for a time, but it can't fix it. And only Jesus can fix that issue there of the heart. But brethren, what the flood does show, what it does display for us, is what will happen to men if they are left in their sin. If men are left in their sin, and women and children, they will be judged. And brethren, we have to be able to conclude in this room today, they will be judged rightly so. There will never be a man, woman, or child judged by the living God who will be judged unjustly. God does not condemn and judge good people. He condemns and judges wicked, evil people whose thoughts and intentions of their heart are only evil continually. And brethren, before Jesus Christ, that was you and me. And the flood, brethren, stands as a testament to that reality. God will judge you. He will judge every man. Brethren, God, He doesn't just judge men, though, here, because this is where this could get twisted, too. God doesn't just judge men here simply because they went about breaking a bunch of rules, right? Oh, you guys are a bunch of rule breakers out there. You're just not following a few of my commandments. Brethren, the judgment is so severe and so necessary because of the nature of this type of rebellion. This rebellion here, this wickedness and this violence that ends up filling the earth, brethren, is an absolute twisting of God's creation, and it's done out of a hatred and a disdain for God. I mean, brethren, the New Testament puts it this way in Romans 1. Listen to how Paul puts men's hearts in view in how they respond to God after the fall. Do men respond in love to God, in worship to God? How do men respond to God in light of what's happened in the fall? Well, he says this about them. For the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men, who by their unrighteousness, what do? They suppress the truth. And here's the truth. For what can be known about God is plain to them, because God has shown it to them. For His invisible attributes, namely His eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly perceived ever since the creation of the world and the things that have been made. And so they are without excuse. For although they knew God, they did not honor Him or give thanks to Him, but they became futile in their thinking, and their foolish hearts were darkened. Claiming to be wise, they became fools and exchanged the glory of the immortal God for images resembling mortal man and birds and animals and creeping things. Brethren, men, because of the corruption of their hearts, it's not that they just break a bunch of commandments. They do that. There's a much deeper issue here in why I think the severity of God's indictment is so severe. Men hate God. After the fall, what once should have been a natural relationship with God and with man is no longer natural. It now needs something supernatural to enter into it. Now what is natural to man is they are at enmity with their God. They don't honor Him. They don't give thanks to them. In fact, they know about Him clearly in some ways, and instead of giving Him thanks and giving Him proper worship, they exchange that truth for a lie. And they end up worshiping things that resemble themselves. And brethren, I think Genesis is trying to make this clear, and why God's pronouncements have to come with such just utter starkness here. And think about how God's last pronouncement in verses 11 and 12, how He says it. He says, "Now the earth was corrupt in God's sight, and the earth was filled with violence, and God saw the earth, and behold, it was corrupt, for all flesh had corrupted their way on the earth." And brethren, you can translate this idea here of corruption as ruin, like you spoil something. You know, like you spoil a dinner, you spoil something that you're making, or you ruin something that you're building. And this is God's judgment upon man. He says man has ruined the earth, right? He says that the earth was corrupt in God's sight, ruined in God's sight. Why? The earth was filled with the corruptness of man because they had what? Corrupted their way. They had ruined their way. And brethren, because man had ruined their way and corrupted their way, the earth has now become ruined. Man has ruined God's creation. He has taken the thing he was supposed to fill and to fill with glory for God. And instead, he has filled it with corrupting things, violent things, wicked things, and he has ruined the earth. And now God's world, brethren, has come undone. And so as we conclude, brethren, I know that is not the that is not the usual way that we typically end. We typically end with something, let's end on a super positive note. But brethren, I think as we do anticipate what is going to come next, because we know what God is going to do next as we continue to get more into what Noah's going to do, what God does through Noah. Brethren, we're going to anticipate how God's going to respond and how He's going to fix the situation. But as we end here today, I think it's important that we end on that note, to be reminded of just how bad the creation got, and just how corrupt things had become and how undone God's creation was. So that when we see next time that God has to bring flood waters of judgment to destroy all sinners, that we could put that in its proper context. And no doubt, brethren, hope's going to remain, right? We read that but Noah, right? But Noah found favor in the eyes of the Lord. And so we know He's going to save a few. We know God's going to do something through this. But brethren, we got to wait till next time. And so as we end today, I want us to ponder, brethren, these words of Genesis. Brethren, to ponder for ourselves the fact that we deserve that very wrath, that very judgment for our own sin and our own corruption. But brethren, that God was gracious to us, and He provided the ark of escape for us in Christ. And so let's end on that today and let's pray.